after President Trump decided to pardon the overtly racist former sheriff of Maricopa County, Arizona, Joe Arpaio, well, one journalist decided to use this as an opportunity to smear Jane Sanders in perhaps the most arbitrary, disingenuous way possible. So it all started when Bernie Sanders released a tweet responding to Donald Trump's decision, saying, "By pardoning Sheriff Arpaio, President Trump has once again made clear where he stands on the side of racism and discrimination." Now, after Bernie Sanders made this statement, New York Times journalist Maggie Haberman responded by saying, "Worth recalling that Jane Sanders appeared with Arpaio once and toured his tent jail." Now, in the absence of context, one might think, well, that's kind of strange. Why would someone like Jane Sanders, who is a progressive, want to be associated with someone like Joe Arpaio? Why would she want anything to do with his jail? But when you actually have the context, well, it becomes clear. Matthew Dessem of Slate explains, "If the idea of Jane Sanders endorsing America's most racist cop seems a little unlikely to you, you have a better nose for fake news than many of Haberman's Twitter followers. So before Jane Sanders' love of Sheriff Joe joins the fake news Hall of Fame, it's worth pointing out how disingenuous Haberman's tweet is. It is true that Jane Sanders appeared with Joe Arpaio, but only in the same sense it is true that Hillary Clinton appeared publicly more than once with Donald Trump. In fact, far from the meet and greet Haberman implies, Jane Sanders was looking at Arpaio's infamous tent city, an outdoor prison where the temperatures hit 130 degrees in the summer, from outside the fences at the behest of immigration rights group Puente, Arizona. Arpaio, sensing a publicity opportunity, ambushed her and offered her a tour. She accepted, and maybe she shouldn't have, but their conversation wasn't particularly friendly. Jane states, "You feel that this is humane, the way you..." And he chimed in saying, "Yeah, it's about 130 degrees during the summer." "Well, let me ask you this," says Jane, "and 135 degrees in Iraq," drawing an equivalence there. And Jane Sanders responded by saying, "Yeah, well," and Arpaio said, "So what's wrong with that?" Jane Sanders replied, "Well, the jails are supposed to treat our people humanely." Arpaio said, "I haven't had any problem." Now, within days, at a rally in Phoenix, Bernie Sanders called Arpaio a bully and described his wife's encounter with him like this. She asked him about racial profiling and he didn't have an answer. She asked him about conditions in Tent City and other abuses that he has perpetuated and he didn't have an answer. You know what? He cannot have an answer because what he is doing is un-American and uncivilized. So, with the proper context, we now know that it's clear Jane Sanders wasn't there to socialize with Joe Arpaio. She's no fan of Joe Arpaio. She was there with Puente, Arizona, an immigration organization, and he's the one who happened to ambush her when she was looking at Tent City. She wasn't looking there and telling him that he was doing a great job with Tent City. She was talking about how inhumane it was. She was lambasting him for his decision. So, of course, Maggie Haberman, after she received backlash, rightfully so, for releasing this disingenuous tweet, she followed up with another tweet saying, "You could look at my Twitter feed for later tweets that clarified something clumsily phrased but not ill-intended." So I'm glad that she admitted that this was clumsily phrased, to say the least, but I am not inclined to believe you, Maggie, that this was ill-intended, because you're a journalist. Your job is to write. So if you can't even get your point across that is a simple point. In fact, I don't even know why you would bring up this to begin with, because Bernie Sanders is calling out Joe Arpaio's racism, and you're saying, well, Jane Sanders was seen with Joe Arpaio. I mean, what was the point of bringing it up if not to prime your Twitter followers into thinking, well, maybe since she is associated with Joe Arpaio and she was with him publicly once and they talked, maybe she sides with him. I mean, that was the point of your tweet, was it not? It seemed like you wanted to imply that Jane Sanders got buddy-buddy with Joe Arpaio. And one Clinton surrogate actually described the encounter as Jane Sanders, quote, playing nice with Joe Arpaio. So it's not like this type of smear is anything new. In fact, this exact smear was already used against Jane Sanders. So you can criticize Jane Sanders if you want to for not being tough enough on Joe Arpaio. I mean, nobody can really be tough enough on him. He's a monster. But to say that she's playing nice with him, or to imply that her association with him that one time makes her a friend of Joe Arpaio or a supporter of his tactics, is downright wrong. It's disingenuous. But I think that Maggie Haberman is smarter than she's letting on. I think she knows that her tactic was, in fact, disingenuous. And the whole reason why she brought it up is because she wants us to assume that Jane Sanders is an ally of Joe Arpaio's. It's a disingenuous and, frankly, sleazy way to try to smear the wife of a senator that might be running for president in 2020 on a platform that you probably don't like. Well, look, here's the deal. If you don't like Jane Sanders, if you don't like Bernie Sanders, then you've got to come up with policies to counter his policy ideas. These smears that are unfounded and ruthless are really getting old to me because it's the same tactic that neoliberals use against progressives all the time. I mean, we saw how the Democratic Party establishment, they couldn't really counter with what Bernie Sanders was saying because all of the policy ideas he was espousing were popular, so they just tried to smear him as a racist and a sexist Bernie bro, or they tried to smear him as a racist and a sexist, and us as racist, sexist Bernie bros. But I mean, look, you've got to counter with policies, but since they can't, they resort to these smears. So I'm not buying what Maggie is selling. I think that she intended to imply that Jane Sanders was somehow fond of Joe Arpaio. She didn't give you the context specifically because she wanted you to think about Jane Sanders negatively. We're on to your tactics. It's what many journalists have done to smear Bernie Sanders arbitrarily so, and I don't believe you. Sorry.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.